So the big picture for this lesson is modeling with sine and cosine functions. First part of the lesson is about writing functions for different sound frequencies. Now remember, the frequency equals 1 divided by the period. So the period and the frequency are reciprocals. And also the period equals 2 pi over the b value in a function. So what does that mean? That means the frequency equals b over 2 pi. So basically, if you know the frequency of a sound, you can solve for that b value and then go ahead and write the function. Let's look at another case. Here's an example from the lesson, and it's all about writing a model for a graph function. And I just want to talk through this because this little skill here of modeling from a graph is super important. So the first thing you do when you're given a sinusoid graph, and that means any sine or cosine function, is you draw where the midline is. That's going to tell you what the vertical translation is. Notice that the midline here is at y equals 1. So that means there's a +1 vertical translation. Next thing you do is you figure out the amplitude. The amplitude is the distance from the midline to the max or min. And until you draw the midline, you can't really figure out the amplitude, which is why the midline is, again, super important. In this case, the amplitude goes from 1 to 3, so that's 2. And that's where this 2 comes from right here. Next thing you do is you find the period and then the b value. So it's really kind of hard to read the exact period of the function, but you do know that when you go from the max to the min, which is half the period, that goes from pi over 4 to 3 pi over 4, and the difference there is 2 pi over 4 or pi over 2. That's 1/2 the period. So that means the entire period is pi. And that means up here, the x value would be 5 pi over 4. And you might be able to try and estimate this from the graph, like, okay, that looks like about pi there, but it's much better to use coordinates, so you're absolutely sure. So this is a horizontal shrink by 1/2, so that means the b value equals 2. And you could also say that the period is 2 pi over b, and the period you found is pi, so you can say pi equals 2 pi over b. And that means b has to equal 2, because 2 pi divided by 2 equals pi. And you can also solve that by making a proportion, cross-multiplying, and so on. Okay, so the b equals 2. That's where this 2 comes from. Finally, what you need to do is determine whether it should be a sine or a cosine function. For this function, you're getting an input at 0 that starts at the midline. Now the sine function starts with 0 at the midline. The cosine function starts at a max. So that's how you can tell whether you're using sine or cosine, and in this case, why you're using a sine function. So that's the type of thinking you're going to be doing in this lesson. That's the big picture.